Hello everyone, welcome to BrainMap. This seminar series is co-sponsored by the P41-funded Center for Mesoscale Mapping housed in Martinos Center. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jonas Obleser. Dr. Obleser researches the processes of perception and listening using methods from the cognitive neuroscience. After studying and obtaining his PhD in psychology at the University of Constance, he worked at the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience in University College London and at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, where he established a research group, Auditor Cognition. Since 2016, he has held the chair of physiological psychology at University of Lübeck, Germany. His current research interests include the neuronal dynamics of perception and cognition and how these processes interact during listening and communication. I would just like to remind the audience to please address any questions using the Q&A box or raise their hands. Dr. Obleser, thank you very much for coming, and virtual stage is yours.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now and can see my slides. It's an enormous pleasure to be presenting to you and the folks from the wider Boston area today. So the talk I've brought along is called Neural States and Traits in the Listening Brain. Before I forget, I should really highlight the people who do the actual work and thank them for their great science they're doing and have been doing in my lab over the last years. And also they've been holding up tremendously well under the pandemic. So here's a big shout out to those whose research you will be seeing in a minute. So I think it's fair to say that my research is and has been quite concerned with the question of why we are successful in challenging listening situations. And for most, you know, we are sitting at conference dinners, or we have been sitting at conference dinners when it was still a common thing to do in these noisy environments. And, you know, we communicate in these situations. And it's an unsolved and very rich scientific question, what determines our listening and communication success in these scenarios. If I would ask you what you think is a factor, most of you would readily say, well, it probably has something to do with age. Biological age is an important factor because there is this common thinking and theme that with age, hearing gets worse, which is true on many levels. What is striking, however, is that it's not very predictive of your objective and particularly your subjective success or enjoyment in a listening situation. So if we ask people a common item from a common hearing aid questionnaire, you are in a group of about 5 people in a busy restaurant, you can see everyone else, can you follow the conversation? I'm sure you will acknowledge this essentially non-correlation here with biological age in this relatively large sample. And we've recently replicated this finding essentially in a big study, which I will be talking about in a minute. And also there, we've seen that the classical pure tone hearing loss that you can measure at an audiometrist and also your biological age, they maybe explain about 5% of the variance here. So there's a lot to be explained. Now, in trying to explain this, it might be helpful to structure the problem a bit. And a very common way of structuring such problems is one that I've actually lifted from the visual sciences, from David Marr. And we should maybe start first asking ourselves, well, what is it a listener actually wants to achieve in a certain listening situation? So what is their behavioral goals? What is their communication goals? And we can then wonder, well, how is the problem being solved? So what would be a good algorithm to tackle a challenging listening situation? This is probably the level where we could start talking about attentional filters, and I will be talking about these in a minute. And it's only then, I think, that you should wonder what are potential neural solutions to it. So what would be a good neural implementation of, for example, an attentional filter? My main agenda today is to highlight that at each of these levels, an individual is bringing their psychological and neurobiological traits, so the things that are specific to the individual listener and that deviates them from other listeners, but also their neurobiological and psychological states, so something that defines their momentary conditions of listening. Now, in tackling challenging listening situations, a common approach would be to say we take a more traditional stimulus response view. So there are stimuli, there is something that we might be calling signal, and something else we might be calling noise. And then there would be some brain processes in between, and outcoming would be some behavioral result that we can measure, some accuracy in a speech and noise test, or any other behavioral report. And this is a very successful research agenda that my lab has also been following for many years. And in particular, we've been focusing on two neural measures, one of them being neural tracking, a whole family of neural processes that we have been looking at that are creating a sort of linear relationship to the ongoing stimuli or signals and noise. And another family of neural processes that here should be subsumed under the term alpha power or alpha oscillations. So endogenous brain oscillations in the 8 to 12 hertz range that also have proven very informative about listening processes. I want to keep this part of the talk rather short, but it's I should mention that we've been for the last 6 years or so very busy studying those two neural processes, neural tracking and alpha power, in an attempt to explain individual listening success at these cocktail party-like communication settings, so in challenging listening situations. And we've done so in a study that covered a broad age range of middle-aged and older listeners. And we've tried to achieve a large sample, at least by EEG and audiology standards. And we've aimed to measure those people twice. We've just done with that, so I will not be able to report many of these longitudinal data to you yet, but this is a rich data set that is also available on Open Science Framework and will hopefully give us more insights over the next years. Now, to cut this very short, this part of the talk, I just want to mention that neural tracking, as I said earlier, is a promising mechanism to tackle the listening success of an individual, or to measure the listening success. And the idea is in principle to establish something that you could call a linear filter or a kernel, so a sort of a stereotypical brain response with which ongoing stimuli, ongoing speech, for example, is being tracked and answered so that you get the brain responses you're actually recording. And in doing so, it's quite an established finding in our field that the attentional goal of a listener is shaping this response. So as you can see here, if a listener has the behavioral goal of attending to a certain ongoing speech signal, their brain response from superior temporal brain areas will be enlarged, in particular in a window that is roughly corresponding to a classical N100 P200 complex. And so this enlarged response is commensurate with the idea of attentional gain. Literally, the signal you want to attend to boost that signal and give it a sort of a neural gain. And a signal, a concurrent signal you want to ignore, is answered by the brain stereotypically with usually a bit of a flatter, reduced response. When we do so, we can show in this large longitudinal study that if you hear two sentences simultaneously to your two ears, the one you want to attend to basically over the time course of a sentence. So what you're seeing here is actually the time course of a sentence of about 2 seconds. This attentional response is building up. So we don't need 1 hour of audio for that. We can do it on 2-3 second stimuli. And this build up is sort of a feature of what we would call neural tracking of attended speech. Interestingly, this can be thought of as a brain state that is predictive of your behavioral success. So a postdoc in my lab, Sarah Thun, has been very busy analyzing those data and studying this. And in her recent paper in Nature Communications, she's showing in great detail that this neural speech tracking response is indicative of your probability of getting a single trial in such a cocktail party correct. So as you can see, if there's more neural tracking, the accuracy the predicted accuracy is higher, and also the speed with which you give your behavioral responses is increased. Neurobiologically, quite separate from that, we've been busy studying the alpha oscillatory responses in the brain. We think very differently of alpha responses. We think of alpha mechanisms as truly endogenous oscillations that are there anyway and that sort of dominate the human electroencephalographic spectrum, as most of you will know. And it's particularly in this, what I would call the endogenous alpha beta range, so somewhere from 8 hertz upwards, that another postdoc in the lab, Mohsen Alavash, has shown that it's these alpha oscillations that are altered in a listening situation in their connectivity pattern primarily. So Mohsen is very concerned with studying connectivity on a large brain scale and sort of describing the connectivity patterns and studying in a graph theoretical sense also their relations. And Mohsen was able to show that during challenging listening situations, there is a sort of hypoconnectivity in the alpha range that is characteristic for these dichotic listening situations. I have to cut that story sort of a bit short or condense it because I want to talk about other aspects of our work. But if I want to summarize for you a bit our neural tracking and alpha power work, we could ask, well, how do neural filters affect adaptive listening? And I think it's fair to say, as a summary of our recent studies, that these two mechanisms, neural tracking and alpha power, are first not very strongly related to each other. So we seem to be looking here at two quite separate neural signatures of adaptive listening in the challenging situations. So we almost, from some studies, actually can by now say there is evidence of absence of a connection between these. And then we can think of them as having distinct separate influences onto listening behavior. So in a series of studies, I mentioned the study by Sarah Thun, but there are, of course, many others from our lab, but also from others, showing that neural tracking, so this quite stereotypical linear tracking of ongoing stimuli, is having an impact on behavior. In a forthcoming study by PhD student Martin Orff, we're also presenting a new way of measuring perceptual sensitivity in such ongoing tasks. So there is a direct path to that. For alpha power, on the other hand, the picture is a bit more that changes in alpha power and alpha connectivity are probably more informative about what we could call post-sensory or even post-perceptual decision processes and biases. So your behavior at the cocktail party is in part affected by your ongoing alpha activity, and your alpha activity will be indicative of your success. But it seems to be the case that it's rather affecting what we could call bias and what in some studies we've quantified as perceptual confidence, almost metacognitive aspects of listening. Now, this is a somewhat unsatisfying view. Why? In part because this traditional view of there's a stimulus coming, the brain is doing something, and out we get behavior is a very incomplete view of what the brain is doing. And what we've been trying more and more over the last years is to put the brain first, to say, well, the brain has not been waiting for our stimuli. It's have dynamics on its own, obviously. And it could be very interesting to study neural states and also neural traits. So what makes my brain different from your brain, a priori, the acoustic stimulation coming in. So just to clarify what I mean by states and traits, I hope you can agree with that definition, that states are generally fluctuating conditions, psycho or neurobiological conditions, whereas traits are rather the relatively stable aspects or features of my psychology, of my neurobiology that characterize me as an individual. So we could say, why does my hearing fluctuate? Why do I have the feeling that I have more trouble today than I had yesterday? This would be a question of the states of listening, while we can also ask, why do you hear differently than others? Why do I hear differently? What makes my hearing different? And this would be a question of neural traits. Now, we've been busy in both sort of branches of this, and they're only, it's nice to draw it like this and to separate it, but obviously in a given study, there are sort of also mixtures of these processes, of course. I've mentioned already this Nature Communications paper down here, and I've also mentioned the recent paper by Mosen Alawash in PLOS Biology. I would like to illustrate a bit our thinking about traits and about neural traits that characterize the listening behavior. I would like to highlight this recent paper from Mosen, also from this large ERC-funded study in a bit more detail. So a few years ago, Mosen, Sarah, and I essentially wondered whether one characteristic of successful listening is to reconfigure on a large scale your brain networks in a way that is adaptive for a listening situation. And in principle, there are at least two interesting ways this could be happening. As you move from basically, for example, laying in the scanner, doing nothing, into a challenging listening situation, your cortical networks could be reconfiguring more towards what we could call functional integration, so that different neural networks start integrating more and talking to each other more closely. And or on the other hand, there could be a tendency towards functional segregation, so that maybe new modules are forming or modules are doing more separately, minding their own business in a listening situation. And either one could be helpful for behavior. So this is what we set out to study here. I should mention as a detail, as a method C detail, if you like those kind of things, that as we went from resting state to a listening state, there was no overall change in connectivity. So whatever I'm showing you next is not simply a function of the correlations between brain areas being higher in general, right? So as you can maybe acknowledge here, all the dots, those 50 people laying on the diagonal, there was on average no change in connectivity. This is maybe important for some of you to keep in mind. Now, what we have observed is that as listeners moved into this task and performed that for an hour, they were reconfiguring in the sense that we observed an increased segregation, essentially. So it was almost as if an additional module was occurring. As you can tell from this branch here, there was a sort of emerging happening of auditory, ventral attentional, and in particular the singular opercular network. Now this is interesting because the singular opercular network keeps making recurrent cameos in the auditory attention or auditory cognition field as a network that every now and then in studies proves very important, and so it did here. And what Mosen could show, interestingly, is that not everybody showed this segregation to the same extent, obviously. And this degree of change in modularity, this degree of segregation that listeners showed was predictive of an individual's success in this challenging listening task, listening to 2 sentences at a time. So those who well, let's say who reconfigured more were the ones who were more likely to respond correctly overall, and also the ones who responded faster. This is down here is to illustrate the actual reconfiguration that was going on, and we've came to the conclusion that such large-scale cortical topological reconfigurations might pose an interesting listening trait. So your ability to reconfigure in response to a challenging listening task is an interesting trait. Now, going back to this dichotomy of states and traits, I want to turn now a bit more to the temporal and the EEG domain and tell you a bit about the work that at the time PhD student in my lab, Leo Waschke, and I undertook, sort of in parallel to the topographic work that Mosen had been doing at the time. We wondered whether the time course of the EEG, besides the oscillatory features and the tracking response I spoke about earlier, also holds interesting dynamic information that might have sort of state-like and trait-like information for us about the listener. And so a measure Leo and I turned to is so-called, well, essentially the phenomenon we're interested in was neural desynchronization. But the measure we've turned to was permutation entropy, or a particular form thereof, which is called weighted permutation entropy. The idea of entropy is, of course, I mean, it's well established. I shouldn't talk in Boston about entropy, but just to give you the overall idea here is that we're studying basically the ordinal patterns. So this is an ordinal measure that basically is just interested in a time series, whether there are more, how many different sort of patterns we're seeing in a certain segment. And in a very boring, very predictable brain signal, you would basically only see a few patterns. For example, in a linearly increasing signal, all you would be seeing would be a little up motive, right? That would be very boring. And in a very unstructured or desynchronized time series, or very entropic time series, you might be seeing a more even distribution of different patterns, up, down, and that's kind of the approach you're taking in a permutation entropy. And Leo took that basically to the next level and asked, what is, if we take such a simple entropy measure to characterize neural desynchronization, is this any good? Is this telling us anything about a listener's behavior and also about the way sounds will be processed as they enter auditory cortex? So first off, let's stick with the idea of traits in listening. And what Leo was able to show is that the average level of entropy your EEG essentially is presenting us with is indeed different for different people, and it holds a linear relationship to age. So the older our participants were, the higher their average entropy. As you can see here, this is essentially the same information. The big graph here simply holds also single trial information, whereas here in the inset you just see the average. And this is interesting on various grounds. It relates nicely to work that Brad Wojtek, for example, is doing in San Diego. He's taking sort of a related approach to studying excitation inhibition balance, which is probably what we're looking at here. He's studying rather the slope of a spectrum, and we're sort of staying in the time domain and studying the entropy in a signal. As it turns out, those measures have something to do with each other, and it might be sometimes more practical also to study simply a time domain signal like we're doing here, and sometimes the spectrum might be more interesting. What I find really exciting about this entropy measure is that it seems to hold its promise. When we move on to our large ERC-funded study that we've recently completed and look for this neural trait of entropy there, we see that the relationship with age generally holds. So the older you are, the higher your average entropy. The correlation is now in a more realistic ballpark, I would think. As is typical, as you move to larger samples, you get more realistic estimates of the true effect size. And I find this 0.25 relationship probably much closer to the, finding much more plausible. What is interesting when we talk about traits is, of course, when I talk about traits, you can ask me to provide you with evidence that this is actually something stable. And one way of doing this is by looking, for example, at different repeated measures within the same subject. So what we're having here is we can measure this sort of entropy with you having your eyes open in one part of the session and your eyes closed at another part of the EEG session. And this is generally having a very, very promising reliability, basically, this entropy measure. So it's a good measure to tell your EEG from somebody else's EEG, also in a reliable fashion. Now, why am I dwelling on entropy so much? In part because it's not only a great trait measure, but as you might be acknowledging here in these scatter plots, it's also a state measure. So if I take your 400 trials from an auditory simple listening task, I can wonder what's different when you present it with relatively high entropy, whereas when you present it with relatively low entropy. And here we could play a little game with each other, and I could play you a simple pitch discrimination task, which is actually what our participants in this study did. So I could play you two tones and ask you which tone is higher. And we will do so now. This is not working so well in online, but you can, I don't know, you can just type 1 or 2 in the chat if you feel like it, or you just do the task for yourself. So which tone is higher, the first or the second? First, second. Okay, somebody courageous. You heard the second is higher. Let's do one more trial. Now, you might have guessed the fun part here is those tones are physically identical. It's the very same wave file I have been playing. What I love about these stimuli is that I tricked you now, but I don't have to trick you. It's really, it's a curious task. There are colleagues like Sugal Amitai who showed a decade ago that you can actually use this for auditory learning. So you can train kids, for example, in pitch discrimination on identical tones. So on a neural level, the interesting bit is that two tones are never really the same. You know, they might be the same physical files, but there is always variation in our sensation and thus often also in our perception. And this is what Leo and I used for this. So what we observed is, first, if you just look at this black bar here, that the probability of reporting the first tone as higher is a bit higher in general. So people have a bit of a tendency to hear the first one as higher for various, also probably acoustic reasons. But as you can see here, there is a relation to the degree of EEG desynchronization, or the neural desynchronization state just prior to the tone, that biases you more or less in this direction. So if you have very high entropy, or your, let's say, auditory cortex is in a relatively desynchronized state as the first tone enters, you're more likely to report that tone as being the higher one. And Leo and I were able to show in a bit more detail that what is happening is that this neural desynchronization state does have an effect on how precise, if you will, a tone gets encoded in auditory cortex. So the intertrial phase coherence, which is a typical measure we're using in this situation to basically express how phase-locked, how stereotypical the event-related response looks. This is a function of the entropy of the desynchronization prior to the stimulus. And again, the degree of stereotypicality of the phase-locked response in auditory cortex is again also predictive of your likelihood of choosing the first tone. So this is not a full mediation. It's rather that desynchronization is affecting your perceptual decisions in ways we don't understand yet. But one path that we can establish is actually via shaping the encoding in auditory cortex. And just to dwell on that a few more minutes, Leo and I took it also one step further because we were so excited, as you notice, about neural desynchronization. And we said, well, why don't we take a bit more control over our listeners? Why don't we record their EEG in an ongoing fashion, in an online fashion, and we read out their entropy as they sit there in our chamber. And whenever we deem a little segment a high entropy state or a high desynchronization state, we shoot a tone, or we shoot a tone into a relatively low desynchronization or low entropy state. And we see what happens on a neural level as well as on a behavioral level. This is interesting in terms of neural states and traits because it allowed us to not only measure desynchronization state in auditory cortex, but in the very same setup, we were also recording the pupil of our individuals. We were doing this first off for technical reasons, because it's a great way of detecting whether somebody blinks, because when you blink, something to your entropy happens, and we don't want that. So we needed the pupil, we needed the eye tracker in place. But then we thought, well, that's great, because we can also measure a much more established neurobiological state, namely arousal. We can use the pupil as an established proxy of your noradrenergic system, basically. So what we were able to do here is to say, we can see how your auditory behavior, your auditory perceptions shape depending on the entropy in auditory cortex, but also depending on a much more global arousal state. So you can treat everything in blue here basically as a sort of as a reference, almost a global reference against we can compare our more local auditory cortex entropy. And the interesting picture that emerged here, and that is to be found in this recent eLife paper from Leo, is that your ability to judge the pitch of a tone seems to be rather optimal, if you will, or least biased at an intermediate entropy state. So we're getting sort of a Goldilocks or a sweet spot or inverted U-shape pattern here, as you can maybe acknowledge up here, what we would call optimality. So 1 minus the criterion is highest for intermediate states of entropy in auditory cortex. And for the pupil, we're seeing also the typical Yerkes-Dodson-like inverted U-shape, but for perceptual sensitivity. So we've tried to illustrate this down here with these sort of cartoonish result curves. These psychometric curves seems to be, the psychometric curve seems to be shifted around depending on entropy in auditory cortex, so biasing your perception. Whereas the arousal, and this is something that other studies have also hinted at, that the arousal is rather changing the perceptual sensitivity or your discrimination abilities for tones. So here we have evidence for two states that are separable, but I think quite elegantly, that's why I love this study, measured at the very same time in the very same trials. Now, this has been a lot of information. I'm sorry if it was a bit dense in this part on a neural state and trait measure, neural desynchronization. But I want to step back from the neurobiological details a bit and end on the last part, an important lesson that I keep forgetting and that I'm relearning, and namely that is that the psychology of listening is not the same as the neurobiology of listening. We've seen this in this initial graph that I had reminding us of David Marr's 3 levels. You can also think of that in this sense, that explaining something at a psychological level is not the same as sort of looking at neurobiological implementations and the neurobiology. And Why I'm saying this here is because we can study psychological states and traits, first off, entirely irrespective of these brain processes. Ultimately, it will be a clever thing to bring it all back together, but sometimes it can also be helpful to think of the psychological differences between listeners that they bring to the table. So we could basically, instead of the brain, also start simply looking at psychological states and traits, and they have explanatory power in their own right, potentially. And to highlight a bit a recent development in our lab, we're thinking that there's also more to the response side. So audiology has classically and understandably focused on accuracy. So how good is somebody performing in a certain challenging listening situation? But for a more holistic look at listening behavior, I think it's important to also look at what people subjectively perceive. And this has often to do with how confident they are in what they have perceived. This has consequences for their ensuing behavior. Like, to give a stupid example, if I'm not sure what I've heard, I might be asking you again, right? I mean, this is a simple behavioral change I'm doing, dependent on the confidence I'm having. So in this last part of my talk, I want to focus on psychological traits, but also look a bit more at arguably more soft or more subjective characteristics of listening behavior. Now, in doing so, it can be helpful to turn to this by now classical look at perception as a Bayesian process. And I don't want to go deep into this, but I just want to throw it up there that we can think of a percept you're holding, an auditory percept, like this pitch percept you just had earlier, as a combination of, or multiplication almost, of the sensory evidence you were provided with. In the case of our WAV files, there was no sensory evidence to start with because those files were identical. And your top-down expectations or hypotheses, or in Bayesian terms, we would call these priors on the other hand. And an idea we went after in this study that I want to tell you about is that individuals might be differing in the degree to which they have such strong hypotheses and strong expectations about what they're hearing. So in Bayesian terms, you could call this precise or overly precise priors. So as you can acknowledge, the orange curve has now become very dense, and in that sense, it's pulling the percept its way. And one way of looking at confidence in such a scenario, a crude way would be to think of it as the precision with which you're holding a percept, or the precision of this posterior percept. And just to highlight for some of the more auditory inclined people here on this in the audience, Tim Griffith, for example, and Will Sadley, they have developed this idea a bit for tinnitus, and others like Phil Corlett have been developing it in great detail for pathological processes in psychosis and hallucinations. And this is a bit the direction former postdoc in the lab, Julia Erb, and I went after. So Julia and I, we also stole a classic psychophysics approach. Namely, we play two sounds to our participants, they make decisions, and we basically then reverse engineer this and build what we could call kernels, again, of what feature needs to be present in a sound so that you perceive it as speech. That's the idea here. So we played in a classical two alternative forced choice paradigm, two sounds to our participants, and they always had to make a decision which one is more likely to contain speech. I will play you an example. Sorry, that was a bit far apart. So you would have to make a decision. Both were not really speech, were they? But you have to make a decision about it. And so we can put all the sounds onto one pile where you said, yes, that's more likely to be speech. And we can put on another pile all the sounds that you've decided were not speech. What you can then do is you can build such a, we call it a speech kernel, a three-dimensional representation of the average sound that you would call a speech sound. And so what we're here seeing is a representation that has frequency. So basically the audio frequency or the cochlear frequency ranging from about, I don't know, about 100 hertz up to 3000 hertz here on the z-axis or z-axis. And two other dimensions that we often use for that are scale. So this is basically the rate with which the spectrum is modulated, so frequencies are modulated, and rate. So this is the temporal degree to which stimulus is modulated. And as you can certainly acknowledge, even if you don't know much about speech acoustics, is that the energy seems to be typically in low frequencies and in low rates. This seems to be typical for speech, and this is actually well known. What is interesting is that we can use such a simple psychophysics approach of demonstrating this. This is the case. But now it's getting interesting, because now we can ask, how are people different in their tendencies to hear speech in these scenarios? So what we did is we used established questionnaires and scales for so-called schizotypy or hallucination proneness. So to be very clear, all the data I'm showing you has nothing to do with schizophrenia at all. The label schizotypy just means that people are characterized by perceptual styles and general thought tendencies maybe that are sort of a bit in the direction or on the spectrum of what also psychotic patients, schizophrenia patients might show more strongly. So a typical item in this questionnaire would be, I often hear a voice speaking my thoughts aloud, or the sounds I hear in my daydreams are generally clear and distinct. And people can more or less agree with these items. And you might know that in a general population, there is a considerable amount of people who have these experiences without actual psychotic illness. So we call these people hallucination-prone individuals, or schizotypy plus individuals. That's what's shown here. So what Julia and I did is we took these speech kernels we had just established by people basically making these decisions, and we tried to understand the data a bit better first. So we ran a data reduction technique, a principal component analysis on it. And quite strikingly, one component that emerged from this was characterized basically, was having the speech typical sort of profile with a lot of energy in the low frequencies and in the low rates, and not so distinctive in terms of spectral modulations. And what we then could do is we could take basically these sort of component scores that individuals had produced and correlated with their questionnaire results, with their hallucination proneness. And it turned out that the degree to which individuals were sort of using those kind of frequencies in their perceptual decisions was correlated with hallucination proneness, basically. So the more hallucination prone you were, the more you were using this sort of unusual representation here. It's maybe easier to acknowledge in this bottom graph. So this is basically the analysis we did, but you can afterwards also break it down in a more intelligible way and say, hey, let's plot the acoustic spectrum of what you consider speech for those who are the lowest 10% on the hallucination scale versus the highest 10% on the hallucination scale. And what you can then maybe see is that those who are highest in hallucination literally downweigh these speech typical low frequencies for the decisions, and rather overweigh or highly weigh frequency contributions in higher frequencies. I think this is almost like a textbook definition of an unusual percept. So I think this is quite comforting, as these scales were supposed to measure unusual perceptions. I want to end on this. This is my last data slide, that these listeners who come with these psychological traits of hallucination proneness are also making these decisions in a more confident fashion. What you see here on the top is basically just a sanity check. If a sound is more speech-like, if it has more typical canonical energy like a speech sound would have, then you and everybody is more confident in characterizing it as speech. This makes total sense. However, if you compare this statistical result up here, so the more different two sounds were, so one was clearly more speech-like than the other, people were more confident, right? So you see this blue line increasing here. This is the typical canonical result, but it's interesting to compare that to a graph where we put not acoustic distances on the x-axis, but this hallucination proneness on the x-axis. And there you can really see that while listeners were overall not being very confident, and you shouldn't be because it was a very ambiguous task, those listeners who were most hallucination prone also reported a substantial amount of trials, so about 30% of trials, as being very confident. So here in this graph, basically, we're bringing together the impact that sensory evidence or acoustic evidence is having on your decisions, but also the impact that perceptual priors in a psychological trait style can have on your perceptions. So with that rather long excursion to psychology and psychological traits, I would like to end my talk and sort of briefly try to wrap up what I've presented you. If we go back to this sort of neural implementation level, I hope to have shown you some evidence for distinct and quite independently acting pathways from brain state via sensory encoding to behavioral outcomes in more or less challenging situations. We've seen that both in the temporal domain, here I'm referring to the EEG desynchronization, as well as in a more topological sense, here I'm referring to the network reconfiguration. There are state and trait signatures that shape the neural encoding of sound and the ensuing listening behavior. And lastly, and that was the point where I started from, listeners do bring their own behavioral goals, and it's a worthwhile endeavor, I think, to characterize your individual listeners by their neurobiological traits and states when you're aiming to understand listening behavior in challenging situations. Thank you very much for your patience and for your kind attention today to my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Obleser. One more time, I would like to remind our audience that please address your questions using the Q&A box or raise your hands. And while people are typing, I will just take the advantage and ask some questions. Mm-hmm. So I want to go to the very beginning of the talk about the alpha. With alpha connectivity, which network, or well, I mean, which, and also like I see occipital lobe.
Right. So maybe, so I didn't do full justice to these data, obviously, and I kindly refer you to Mosen's great recent publication on this. What our goal, so two things to alpha. What I didn't even show you today is that a first typical result in these kind of situations is that you get parietal, sometimes leading into occipital, but it's a pretty distinct parietal alpha source that is involved in these attentional processes in a cocktail party listening scenario. Not unlike the attentional orienting you're seeing in any kind of Posner task. So this is a typical alpha, and we're reporting that in the Nature Communications paper in great detail. Mosen here took a slightly different approach. He said, he's interested, or we were interested in a more wholesome whole brain approach. So what we did, all the data was transferred to source space, and we worked on a grid-like structure. And so in parts for practicality and in parts for doing justice to the rather crude EEG data we're having, we here, and in this connectivity plot you're seeing up here, we work basically with very crude brain areas, so frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital, right? And so you've seen, right, that this hypoconnectivity we're seeing here is mostly restricted to indeed occipital and parietal occipital areas. Now, on an interpretational level, one might well say this is commensurate with a functional inhibition idea. So I think when you look at that map, it looks like the typical alpha map. And what you're seeing is that in this challenging listening task, this sort of network is relatively reduced. However, I should be careful with doing this reduced movement, because we're showing that it's not power. It's literally the connectivity that is changing. I think it's very noteworthy. We went at great length at convincing ourselves that this is not confounded notably by just sheer alpha power being reduced, but it's literally a change in the connectivity patterns within these. Well, let's call it the default alpha network, where connectivity seems to be changing in listening.
Okay. We have a question, Yurki. Let me see. Can we Yurki, you are now a panelist. Would you like to just ask your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Jonas, for this very exciting talk.
Thank
and
you.
I was just excited and feeling very reassured of the correlation plot at the beginning of the talk about how aged people actually felt pretty good about their ability to follow this. But was that like somehow related to their actual audiometric type ratings or results?
Oh, well, so to be clear, this was, this is my sort of introductory, this was my introductory graph. It was supposed to be a bit provocative. So it's not that those people did not have beginning hearing problems. They did. But what's important here is that they didn't feel subjectively impaired in this kind of restaurant situation. This is the important point here. I might want to show you rather from our big ERC study this graph. Maybe this is helpful. So again, in this study that has been behind a lot of the data I've shown you, we had 155 older participants. And you can see here in this upper right-hand graph, the typical audiograms, and you see what you would expect. The older people are having the worst audiograms. So this is the dark line here. So that's totally to be expected. But again, down here, you see how age is, I would say mildly predictive of behavior in a cocktail party situation. And so is the pure tone average. So the hearing loss is also mildly predictive. But I think you can look at these graphs and either come away from it by saying, oh, there is a linear relationship with age and with hearing loss, or you can come away and say, yeah, but it's not explaining too much of the variance. And I was, for this talk today, rather taking the stance of saying it's not explaining all the variance, of course. But I would have also been surprised if we wouldn't have found any relationship to age or any relationship to hearing loss. And I think so. I think this gives me some confidence in that this is a representative sample we're having here. Yeah, it's sort of having the beginning hearing problems, but the hearing problems are not very predictive of the real life speech problems, basically.
Thank you.
I have one more question. If we have time, then
Sure.
we should wrap up soon. So so you showed that there is a segregation actually. When and what do you think? Which trait it actually shows, because and there was as far as I remember, there was a correlation with trait and segregation, right?
Yeah, so I haven't shown you, to be very honest, I haven't shown you in the talk too much evidence that this is actually a trait, the reconfiguration. We're arguing for it to be a trait, and we have some evidence that we're in the process of analyzing, because we've brought back from those about 50 people, we brought about 30 back 2 years later. So we will have also some longitudinal evidence to see how this holds up. What we've done so far is we've done some splits within the session, basically some block against block correlation. So I do think there's some stability to this reconfiguration, but our emphasis here was on saying the difference between people in degree of reconfiguration is predictive of the differences in behavior we're seeing, basically. So this is what's shown here. So every dot is one subject, and as you can acknowledge, this is Z-scored, but obviously some are above average reconfigurators or segregators, if we want to call them, and others are below average reconfigurators. So somebody who's not reconfiguring would be basically reusing their resting, so the network would be the same as it was while they were in the resting state measurement just prior to the task.
Yeah. Did you check their confidence as well?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if I don't have any confidence measure, would be carefully using response speed sometimes as a measure of as a crude proxy for confidence. If you want to do that, you could take response speed here as confidence, but that's as good as it gets, I'm afraid.
Okay.
So it's not good.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the great talk. It was very interesting, and thank you to our audience, and see you next week. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you very much. Bye.